Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bev Lang, and I'm the Executive Officer with Elder Abuse Action Australia. I'd firstly like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia on which we meet this afternoon and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. I pay my respects to their elders past and present. Myself, I'm on Darkinjung land on the central coast of New South Wales, about an hour and a half north of Sydney. Welcome to the second edition of the relaunched Lunch and Learn program. We're terribly excited that today we've had more than 500 people register for this important webinar, quite a substantial uplift, as they say, in our previous versions. And we're looking to continue to build on this momentum. Before I launch into some housekeeping, we do have some questions that we'd like to ask before Shawnee speaks today, and they should be appearing on your screen now, or at least very shortly. We'd just like to take a minute for you to respond to those questions whilst I'm doing some housekeeping, and we'll show you the results as soon as we can. Please use the chat, which is in the bottom of your screen, to raise any questions you have or to make any comments. In doing so, please respect each other in your interactions with other Lunch and Learn participants as well as the speaker. Shawnee will respond to any questions throughout her presentation if that's possible and appropriate. We'll just prompt her through the course. But if we have time at the very end, we'll move into a more formal Q&A before we conclude. On the bottom of your screens is the opportunity to turn on CC captions. So if you're requiring that, please turn those on now. We are recording this session and it will be made available to firstly release through to all participants who've registered for this Lunch and Learn session, and it'll also be uploaded onto the EAAA web page on eaaa.org.au, and you'll be able to share that with colleagues should you wish to at a later point. We appreciate your feedback, and to that end, there'll be a quick and short survey that will be sent to you at the end of the webinar, sorry, for you to just give us feedback on whether you found the content useful and whether this is a program that you'd like to remain interested in. Are we going, James? We can end the process yet? No, still going. So we'll just hold off on publishing those polls. So our presenter today is Shawnee van Poeteren, who is the Program Manager with Advocare in Western Australia. EAAA and Advocare have had a long history working together, and we really do welcome Shawnee's participation today. She is a passionate social justice and human rights advocate with 30 years' experience in the management and coordination of aged care, Aboriginal health, and community and allied health services. As a member of Advocare's leadership team, Shawnee has extensive, in-depth knowledge of the aged care sector, current aged care issues and reforms, elder abuse more generally, and how older people can protect their rights and live their best lives. Please join me in welcoming Shawnee to today's presentation. She'll be speaking to Death by 1,000 Cuts, which will delve into the profound impact that this largely silent and harmful form of elder abuse has on older people. She'll examine the who, what, and why associated with coercive control. Thanks so much, Shawnee.
Thanks, Bev. Thank you for that warm welcome. I'm going to share my slides. This is going to go horribly wrong, I think, but we will have our fingers crossed that it doesn't. Bev, can I ask you what you can see on your screen?
I can see the slide with notes. So whilst you're, yes, I'm just going to share the results of the poll while you're adjusting your screen. And most people are familiar with the term, sorry, somewhat familiar with the term of coercive control. In question 2, a 99% response to a pattern of controlling behaviours. So people have a good understanding of coercive control, or what describes coercive control.
Yeah.
In the response to have you ever witnessed or suspected coercive control in the context of elder abuse, 43% said they had. And in the last question, what are the top 2 presenting signs of coercive control in older people? Most people have responded financial control and restricting access to money. But isolation from friends and family was closely followed.
Beautiful. Thank you for that. Gives me some basis. It's clearly out and about and present in the community when most people have either witnessed it firsthand or suspected it. Okay, I will start by thanking you again for introducing me and also for the invitation. When we put the submission to you last year and were selected, we were thrilled. So thank you so much for having me today. And just everyone else on the screen, most of you won't know me. However, I just wanted to provide a little bit of information around myself to, I suppose, set the scene and give you some context for today's discussion. As Bev read out my bio, I'm not an academic or researcher, but I do bring both personal and professional experience in the area of coercive control. I've also been the sort of person that has felt compelled to address challenging topics my whole life, but particularly in the job that I currently do, because I honestly believe that the most difficult conversations are exactly the ones that need to be had. So with that said, let's launch into the first Lunch and Learn of 2025. So I know all of you here today have willingly registered to attend today's presentation, knowing what the topic is and what the likely content would be, but I still wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that it can be confronting and triggering. So please, if you need to at any point disconnect or take time out, please do. You can reconnect at a later time, or you can watch the recording post the presentation. I just wish they would take what they want and be done with it. The relentless pressure, the never-ending uncertainty, and the constant threats are debilitating. Every single day feels like a battle I can never win. Living like this isn't living at all. It's unbearable, it's exhausting, and it feels like a slow, inescapable form of torture. This powerful and true statement from an older person highlights and confirms what many of us already know, that coercive control is excruciating and it's exhausting, and at times it's fatal. Actually saying these words out loud, I can really feel how overwhelmed and hopeless the older person is about their current situation and their future. So when I was trying to decide for a title for this presentation, I wanted to use an expression that would accurately convey the intended message. And death by 1,000 cuts is often used to describe covert abuse, as it illustrates a pattern of subtle, repeated, and cumulative actions that slowly undermine a person's well-being, their self-esteem, and sense of self. And considering today's topic, I felt this title would be a great fit for the presentation. I've heard and read many different definitions of coercive control, however, had landed on this one to share with you today. Coercive control is defined as a pattern of controlling behaviours which a person uses to cause harm, which a person who causes harm uses to establish and maintain control over another person. It presents as an series of intentional actions, I'll repeat that, intentional actions directed at a person to instill fear, intimidation, humiliation, and isolation. Sadly, right now, throughout Australia, there are likely to be thousands of people doing their best to put on a brave face and get through their day, despite feeling hopeless, helpless, confused, and very, very alone. So the answer to who can be subject to coercive control is the answer is anyone. Regardless of culture or gender or age, it does and it can happen to anyone. And although we're used to hearing this type of abuse that's often associated with family and domestic violence involving much younger people, it's really important to recognise that older people are also vulnerable to power and control dynamics. Therefore, they're not at all immune to the effects of coercive control. And according to the 2021-22 Personal Safety Survey released by the ABS, there's an estimated 3.6 million people, I think that equates to 2.2 million adult women and 1.4 million adult men have experienced emotional abuse by a partner at some point since the age of 15. And while the survey doesn't specify the age ranges of respondents, it is reasonable to assume that the older people were included in this figure too. So the next 3 slides in the presentation, including key insights on the screen now, are based on data from the WA Elder Abuse Helpline over the past 12 months. As you can see from the insight summary, the data consistently shows that elder abuse is most frequently reported as female-on-female abuse, and this has been the case quarter by quarter for the last couple of years. So this slide shows the caller profile and the most common forms of elder abuse reported. And there are 2 key points I want to highlight from this slide. First, there are no recorded cases of sexual abuse in the data. However, whether or not it's disclosed and reported, we know that older people do experience sexual abuse, both within and outside the context of coercive control. And secondly, coercive control is not currently a category we track in the data collection. However, over the past 2 years, the terms coercion and coercive have been mentioned 373 times by individuals speaking to our team about their own concerns or concerns for a loved one. This highlights the significant impact of coercive control, even if it's not formally recorded at the present time. This slide again highlights most of the people causing harm to an older person are close to them, in proximity and with ties that bind. The wheel on the left-hand side shows that most people are family members, as we already know, or someone close to them, a friend or a neighbour. So before we explore the impacts of coercive control on older people, it's important to recognise how ageism intersects with elder abuse. So next up, I'd like to share a story, one that invites you to step into the scene as it unfolds. This story is titled A Silent Shift. So the pub was loud with laughter and conversation, shared stories and clinking glasses. At one of the larger tables sat a family spanning 4 generations, their voices weaving together in lively connection. Among them was an older woman, possibly in her early 80s, her presence as vibrant as the chatter surrounding her. She leaned in, actively engaged, her eyes bright as she enjoyed time with her family. As the conversations ebbed and flowed, a natural lull settled over the table. Seizing the moment, the elderly woman began to share a recent experience, one that had clearly left an impression on her. Her voice carried the details with clarity, painting a picture of the event, how it made her feel, and how it had all been resolved in the end. As soon as she had finished, her daughter sitting right beside her let out a dismissive laugh. "Mum, that's not exactly how it happened," she announced, her tone light but laced with condensation. "You always seem to exaggerate things." She turned to the rest of the table, systematically dismantling the story her mother just shared, poking holes in the details, offering her own correct versions of events. The older woman shifted in her seat, her expression dimming. The quiet humiliation settled over her, her fingers twitching slightly on the stem of her wine glass. The joy of storytelling drained from her, now replaced by uncertainty. After a moment, she murmured something about needing to leave the table for a moment, slowly rose, then walked away. As soon as she was out of sight, her daughter leaned in, lowering her voice but ensuring those closest to her could hear. Mum's memory isn't what it used to be, she confided with a knowing sigh. She's starting to forget things, always embellishing, making things bigger than they are. Honestly, I don't think it'll be long before I have to move her in with me to keep an eye on her, you know. She's in her 80s now, so what do you really expect? A few people nodded awkwardly, others simply sipped their drinks. When the older woman returned, the atmosphere had shifted. The warmth from earlier had cooled. Conversations that once welcomed her now bypassed her entirely. A few people still offered polite smiles, but didn't truly fully engage. When she tried to rejoin, responses were brief, disengaged, as she was no longer fully part of the group. She was still sitting in the table, surrounded by family, but she had been quietly yet deliberately pushed to the edges. She had been isolated in plain sight. This scene I have just described is actually something I watched unfold at a popular pub here in Perth, and sadly it's all too common. I've witnessed similar before in different forms with different faces. What is happening for this person is a slow erosion of dignity, masked as concern, ageism disguised as care, and beneath it all, the subtle beginning of control. Next slide, please, James. Thank you. Ahead of diving into the science and examples of coercive control, I'd like to take a moment to highlight the barriers older people face when experiencing coercive control and elder abuse. While all 9 tiles represent what are known to be common barriers, the one that stands out most for me is simply choosing not to. This refers to a person who is aware of what's happening to them but chooses not to seek help for their own personal reasons, which is often because they want to maintain a relationship with the person causing harm. Just as people have the right to seek help, they also have the right to choose not to. And since most older people are harmed by someone they know and love, acknowledging the abuse can be incredibly difficult. Speaking about it to someone else is even harder. And once abuses are shared, it becomes more real and the sense of vulnerability can grow. Fear of judgment is one of the greatest barriers older people face. And lastly, one very important point I want to highlight is that many people may not realise they are experiencing abuse or mistreatment, so clearly they don't seek help or support. Sadly, there are numerous cases where a spouse has exerted coercive control over their partner for decades, and when the spouse passes away, the cycle of abuse often continues, with the adult child now becoming the new source of harm. Next slide, please, James. So we've got the terrible trio on screen for you now. Gaslighting, manipulation, and social isolation. They're all intertwined and they rarely occur independently, but instead overlap and amplify each other. So I'll just speak through each of the examples and give you some more commentary around all of those. So gaslighting can take many forms, and some of the common examples are dismissing an older person's memory and recollections. So an older person recalls an event or conversation, and the person causing harm tells them that never happened, or you must be confused again. Hiding or moving things to create doubt. An older person keeps their personal and legal documents in a certain place, and the person causing harm moves them, says to the older person, "You've been forgetting everything lately. Maybe we should start managing your belongings for you." Or rewriting history. An older person remembers raising concerns about a financial decision, and the person causing harm insists, "You agree to this, don't you remember?" Next up is manipulation, and it can present as many, many ways. However, the three that I'll speak to today is about undermining the confidence of an older person. The person causing harm convinces the older person they are incapable of making decisions by telling them, "You're getting confused again, let me handle it." Or they use emotional blackmail, and this can play out if an older person doesn't comply with what the person causing harm wants. They threaten to self-harm or abandon the older person entirely. A common one is changing legal documents, pressuring the older person into changing their will or their power of attorney, sometimes saying things like, "This is just a formality. You know you can always trust me to do the right thing, don't you?" And finishing off this trio of abuse with social isolation. As with gaslighting and manipulation, there are unfortunately too many examples to share, so I've just picked the most common three. First one is restricting contact with family and friends. An older person receives a call that is intercepted by the person causing harm, and the caller is told, "Sorry, she's asleep right now, she can't talk to you." Or moving an older person away from their community. An older person who has lived in the same house or community for decades is relocated to another suburb or city or country, and they're told that they need to be closer so they can be taken care of. And the last one is controlling visits and communication. This is more often than people realise is happening. The person causes harm becomes a self-appointed gatekeeper for the older person. "He's not feeling well today, so maybe another time." Or what we hear a lot is that the person causing harm will intercept a person's device, whether it be a mobile phone, a computer. They'll delete any text coming through, missed calls, emails, or they'll just block the contact altogether, and the older person is usually completely unaware that that's the case. Next slide, please, James. So I'm second guessing my choice of using this terminology because it's incredibly hard to say. But on your screens now is a statement explaining what cognitive dissonance is. What we know about it is that it can often encompass gaslighting, manipulation, and social isolation, especially in the context of coercive control. And older people and these things combined can amplify the feeling, making it more difficult for the victim to escape the control of the person who is causing the harm. It's important to note that older people living with cognitive impairment have increased risk of experiencing cognitive dissonance. When an older person lives with cognitive impairment, they may struggle more with processing conflicting information or reconciling contradictions in their beliefs and perceptions. This can make it harder for them to recognise inconsistencies or to make clear decisions, which can lead to greater discomfort when they encounter situations that challenge their understanding of reality. In situations of coercive control, this vulnerability can be exploited, making it easier for the person causing harm to create confusion and dependency. And so before we move on to the next few slides, which showcase how cognitive dissonance can manifest in the coercive control of older people, I'd like to share a not so fun fact with you. So that not so fun fact is that cults have long exploited cognitive dissonance to boost members' loyalty, pushing them to justify extreme actions in order to align with the group's beliefs. This psychological tension plays a key role in keeping members committed to both the group's ideology and its leader. It's a little bit terrifying to think that there are many people who may think the same way as people like Charles Manson and David Koresh are around in community and exerting power and control dynamics over older people. Next slide, please, James. This is one of the 4 slides that will give examples around how cognitive dissonance can play out. So an older woman's adult son constantly tells her, "You know I love you. I'm only doing this to protect you. I know what's best for you. You don't need to worry." In reality, he's taken away her access to money, or he's prevented her from seeing her friends, or dismissed her opinions. And she starts to believe, or she believes her son loves her, yet his actions make her feel powerless. She rationalises this by thinking, maybe he's right. Maybe I do need his help. Next slide, James, please. So this is denying their reality, denying the reality of an older person. An older man insists he remembers a conversation where his daughter promised to take him to the doctor. She responds with, "We never had this conversation," or "You must be getting confused again," or "Your memory isn't what it used to be." The older man clearly remembers this conversation, but the daughter keeps on denying it. He starts then to doubt his memory, thinking, maybe I really did forget. Maybe I am losing my mind. Thanks, James. Undermining confidence while claiming to help. An older woman wants to handle her finances, but her daughter constantly says things like, "You always used to be good with your money, but lately you've been making mistakes. Please don't stress yourself. I'll take care of everything for you. It's too complicated for you now." The older woman is still capable, but she starts doubting herself. She thinks, I used to be independent. Am I really becoming incapable? And the last slide is being encouraged to doubt trusted relationships. This happens so many times because of family conflict and dysfunction. And the example here is an older woman is close to her niece, but her son says, "She only visits because she wants your money," or "You can't trust her, she's trying to turn you against me." The niece has always been loving and supportive, but the older person starts questioning a long-term relationship because of the conflicting messages she's been given. So we're on to red flags now. And the following 2 slides will highlight both some more obvious and some subtle signs of coercive control affecting older people. We'll start with the first red flag slide and some of the examples. So I'll read out what's on the tile. I'll go from left to right, top to bottom, and then provide an example of each. Threatening to expose personal information or secrets. For decades, an older person has kept a secret about having a child born outside marriage and placed for adoption. When a family member discovers this information, they use it to exert control, making unreasonable demands, extorting money, and manipulating the older person through fear of exposure. The threat of revealing the secret is enough to maintain control over them indefinitely. No acknowledgement or accountability. An older person living with relatives depends on them for medical appointments, meal preparation, and household tasks. However, their requests for assistance are repeatedly ignored. If they seek support from others, their relatives respond with threats. To outsiders, the relatives deny any neglect, insisting that they provide care, but claiming the older person is simply confused and doesn't remember the help that they receive. Inconsistent behaviours, charming in public and abusive in private. An older person's daughter appears to be the perfect supporter in public. She's affectionate, she's attentive and kind. Mother and daughter are often seen in the community together, and there is nothing about the interactions or behaviour that would suggest abuse is occurring. Behind closed doors, however, the daughter is cold, impatient and cruel. She snaps when asked a simple question, refuses to let her mum have visitors, and is constantly critical of everything she says or does. And the last one on screen is financial control. An older person who is financially secure and owns his own home is convinced by his son to appoint him as power of attorney just to help with the bills. Once the son has control, he restricts the older person's access to his own money, giving him only a small allowance and refusing to explain where the rest of the funds are going. The older person checks his bank statements and queries transactions on the account. The son gets defensive, won't directly answer any questions, he is asked and states that the older person previously agreed to the money being spent. Next slide, James, please. So next up are the more subtle pink flags and their examples. Encouraging an older person to make unnecessary changes. An older person living in their home for decades and is still independent. A family member frequently visits and keeps suggesting that the older person move into a smaller apartment even though they are settled, happy. The family member will often say things like, "Wouldn't you be more comfortable in a smaller place? This house is too big for you." Or, "I found a great little retirement village. I think you should sell this house before it gets too hard to manage." The absence of people who you are usually closely connected with. An older person begins to notice that they haven't heard from their closest friend in quite a while. They usually stay in touch regularly through texts and calls, but weeks have passed without any communication. Feeling concerned, they mention it to their spouse, who dismisses their worries, saying that the friend probably needs some more space and that they should wait for them to reach out first. Speaking on your behalf without consent. An older person goes to a medical appointment with a family member. When the GP asks how they are feeling, family member immediately answers for them. Each time the older person tries to speak, the family member interrupts or downplays their concerns. The GP assumes the family member is being helpful and stops directing questions at the older person. And the last title on the slide is Kindness Peppered with Criticism. An older person lives with their daughter. The daughter often does nice things for the older person, but every act of kindness comes with a passive-aggressive remark. The older person feels like they are being constantly criticised, even when their daughter is supposedly being helpful. Thank you, James. Next slide. So on screen now are some of the most effective techniques to assert and maintain control. And when both love bombing and stonewalling are combined, they create a deeply confusing and emotionally distressing experience for an older person, especially in the context of coercive control or elder abuse. Due to the powerful impact of both techniques, an older person is likely to experience increased dependency and self-doubt. That's because love bombing makes the older person feel valued, special, and emotionally dependent on the person causing harm. But stonewalling that can take the form of silent treatment or emotional withdrawal then creates uncertainty and anxiety, making the older person question what they did wrong. This cycle will erode an older person's confidence, leading them to seek validation from the person causing harm, which then reinforces the control. An older person can experience heightened confusion and emotional exhaustion. That drastic shift from warmth, which is the love bombing, to cold detachment, which is the stonewalling, can leave the older person feeling emotionally exhausted and unsure of where they stand. This inconsistency can cause cognitive dissonance, that word again, making it harder for them to recognise the manipulation. Older people often experience increased compliance and fear of abandonment as well. As an older person, especially one who's isolated or reliant on the person causing harm, may comply with demands to avoid pain of being ignored, and fear of abandonment or rejection might make them more likely to tolerate the mistreatment. We see that time and time again. So next up, we have a case study, and this is Mary's story. This story highlights an older person's decline under the control of someone who is very precious to her. So meet Mary, everyone. She is 80 years of age. She lives alone. She has 3 adult children, and she is currently physically and socially active. Mary is an 80-year-old widow, lives alone in a modest home in the metropolitan area. She has 3 adult children, 2 daughters and a son, James, who lives nearby. James is 53 years of age, and has been divorced for several years. He has a history of financial issues, unemployment, and emotional instability. Over the past 5 years, Mary's relationship with James has become increasingly strained as he has begun exhibiting controlling and manipulative behaviours towards her. Mary has always been an independent person, and despite her age, she remained physically active, participating in community events and maintaining her social circles. However, in recent years, she has started to withdraw from these activities. Her physical health has also begun to decline due to arthritis and other age-related issues, which makes her more reliant on her family for assistance. James began his coercive control behaviour subtly, initially offering to help with household tasks and offering to take Mary to doctor's appointments. However, his assistance soon became a means to manipulate and isolate Mary. James started by telling her that she was too old to manage on her own and she should consider selling her home and moving in with him for her own safety and well-being. Mary resisted as she had no desire to leave her home, but James kept persisting, using guilt and emotional manipulation to wear her down. He frequently reminded her that her daughters were too busy with their own lives to help her, implying that they didn't care as much about her well-being as he did. James also began to undermine Mary's confidence by telling her she was forgetful and incapable of managing her finances or making decisions. He subtly encouraged her to give him access to her financial accounts, claiming that he could manage her money better than she could, as she was too old to understand modern banking systems. As James continued to exert control, he also began isolating Mary from her friends and family. He discouraged her from attending social events or visiting her daughters, saying he had concerns for her safety and her health. He started accompanying her to doctor's appointments, insisting on being present during consultations and questioning medical professionals about her treatment plans. He would then relay a distorted version of her health to her daughters, making them believe Mary's cognitive and physical abilities were much worse than they actually were. James would be caring and charming in public, but he would frequently criticise Mary when they were alone, calling her weak, irresponsible and stupid, leading her to believe that she was no longer capable of making decisions for herself. This constant belittling eroded Mary's self-esteem, and she began to rely more on James for emotional support, reinforcing his control over her. James's coercive control escalated into financial exploitation. He convinced Mary to add him to her bank accounts, promising that he would take care of her finances. But over time, he began withdrawing money for his own needs, paying off his debts with Mary's savings, and purchasing luxury items for himself. Whenever Mary questioned these actions, James would accuse her of being ungrateful for his care and support, or he would belittle her for not trusting him. When she became distressed and attempted to limit his access to her accounts, James would threaten to stop helping her altogether, leaving her isolated and helpless. The turning point came for Mary when her neighbours noticed her decline. They observed that James was frequently at her home, but Mary no longer engaged with them or attended social gatherings. They also noticed that Mary appeared increasingly withdrawn and confused, and her once pristine home was now in a state of disrepair. One of her neighbours reached out to Mary's daughters, who immediately visited her. During the visit, they were alarmed by her fragile state and the visible changes in her home. And upon further conversation, Mary confided in her daughters about the extent of James's manipulation and control. She described how she had become afraid to speak up, as she feared James would cut her off entirely. Her daughters helped her to contact a helpline for support, information, and referral. After the call to the helpline, Mary felt empowered as she had been validated and believed. So she and her daughters asked James to meet for a family meeting to discuss Mary's concerns. James agreed to the meeting and was confronted with evidence of financial and emotional abuse. James, of course, denied the accusations, showed no accountability or acknowledgement, and unfortunately his relationship with Mary was permanently damaged. He was removed from Mary's financial accounts and restrictions were placed on his ability to access any of her assets. Her daughters arrange for a trusted financial advisor to assist Mary in managing her finances independently. Mary also received counselling to help rebuild her confidence and regain her independence. With the support of her daughters, she gradually re-engaged in social activities, and her health improved as she received the appropriate care and attention from healthcare professionals. Unfortunately, there are thousands of Marys across the country. This story is all too common, and they're experiencing coercive control at the hands of someone that they never imagined would cause them any harm. This case also illustrates how coercive control can manifest in the life of an older person, often escalating over time and resulting in significant harm to their physical, emotional, and financial well-being. It also highlights the importance of early intervention, as well as the role of family, friends, and neighbours in recognising the signs of coercive control and the opportunity to offer support. Thank you, James. We've now arrived at the last few slides of the presentation, so I'd like to end with just some key messages. To the professionals and community here today, if you have the opportunity at any stage, please speak out against the injustice and harm that coercive control inflicts on older people. Practical support can be provided in many ways, but a few I'll share with you today. One is by believing the older person, even if their story seems fragmented or unclear. You can take a stand by helping to normalise conversations about coercive control and its impact on older people. You can support by connecting them with relevant services such as helplines, legal centres, counselling services, and sharing resources in a format that suits the older person's needs, whether that be printed materials, digital, or in verbal information. Your understanding and support can honestly make a real difference to the lives of older people. Second last slide, please, James. And to any older people watching live today, I hope there is older people, but if there's not and they watch the recording, if there's anyone here today experiencing coercive control, and if you're unsure about speaking up, please remember this. There are people you can trust who will listen to you and believe you. You are not stupid or crazy. Your feelings and experiences are valid. You are not alone, and you're going to be okay. And there is support and information available so you can help regain your confidence, independence, and control. And the final slide, I believe, James. So a big thank you to everyone that has registered and attending today. I hope that you found something small at least, that I've shared today that you find useful. However, my bigger hope is that you all go away from the session and keep the conversation about coercive control alive. Please always remember, we can't ignore what refuses to stay silent. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, James and Bev.
Thanks so much, Shawnee. A very powerful presentation. I think would be a gross understatement of what you just presented, and a constant reminder to how much attention we all need to pay to the behaviour of ourselves and those around us. We do have some interesting questions and a comment from Linda that I think would be requiring your response if you can. And just for noting if there are other questions that bob up, we've got about 15 minutes to go. If we don't get to answer, if Shawnee doesn't get to answer all the questions, then we'll certainly collect those and gather her responses if we do run out of time, and share that with everybody. So I've popped those questions into your chat, Shawnee, but Tina asks, as there is no data on sexual abuse in the 2023-24 year, is this due to the CERS reportable guidelines and reportable to the Commission?
We don't, from an Advocare point of view, we don't hear what has been sent through to CERS. I think Obviously, we get the reports from the Commission like everyone else does. I believe people understand that sexual abuse is a type of abuse, and so they think that because it is incredibly destructive, and it is abuse that should be reported directly to the authorities, meaning the police. People aren't very likely to call us at all. They will go straight to the police. But with psychological abuse, financial abuse, people are a little unsure what's happening. They want to come to us to sort of like gauge what they can term what's happening to them. Sexual abuse, unfortunately, we don't hear about too often. We do a lot of education to residential aged care homes around sexual assault and how that manifests for an older person, but we don't hear too many come straight direct to us.
Mm. And of course, we know that lots of people don't report abuse that occurs to them. So 2/3 of people don't report, according to the prevalence study from 2021. Diane asks, grandparent alienation is defined as elder abuse and coercive control is involved, but there is no protection in South Australia other than going down the family law route, expensive and time consuming. When will grandparent alienation be on the agenda moving forward? Do you have any thoughts?
I have lots of thoughts, but I mean, we hear this all too often, and it is an absolute way that adult children do exert control over an older person. I think that it needs a lot more focus and attention that's currently there, because like lots of other forms of abuse, it's not spoken about. It's something that's accepted, and the older person is less likely to speak up about what's happening to them, because it shines a spotlight on what's happening, in their interpersonal relationships.
And the threats of taking away access to the grandchildren and financial assets, those kinds of things are
absolutely
also defer any kind of action on it often. Certainly when we publish an article on grandparent alienation on Compass, it's often the most read article by people looking at Compass, obviously, and looking at our social media, and it's really gut-wrenching, the stories that we hear through the comments on those articles and through our Facebook pages. Really gut-wrenching.
it is.
So Diane, I don't think we have any immediate answers, but it's certainly something I think it falls into more the coercive control part of elder abuse, but legally it's a very confusing and confounding, complex issue, and because we don't have consistency in the law across states and territories, even more difficult to grapple with and come up with a national approach.
Yeah.
Nalika asks, could you please explain the rationale behind not including elder abuse in the coercive control legislation? What work currently is in place for further reforms?
That's probably not a question that I can answer. Bev, you're probably a better person to speak to that topic, because I would get it all wrong, and that would be remiss of me not to pass on to you. You'd have more expertise there.
Again, there's difference. I wish I had my colleague Vicky Nash on this webinar, because one of the things we've talked about is that in some legislation, coercive control is only about the intimate partner and doesn't include children. So therefore doesn't necessarily always include elder abuse. I believe ACT is different, but certainly New South Wales doesn't include, is my understanding anyway, elder abuse, or at least anything beyond an intimate partner. It's great to have it in place, but the awareness of coercive control, that is an important element that, attorneys general and other political leaders are aware of the scourge of coercive control and the extent of coercive control. but it certainly continues to be on our radar. And in terms part of what I'm currently looking at EAAA's draft submission on the draft national plan to end the abuse and mistreatment of older people in Australia, and that's certainly part of our submission. In terms of other reforms, they are many and varied. We do want national. We do want harmonisation across the country on enduring powers of attorney. We would like a national register. I think the current draft of the plan, certainly talking about national consistency, which is important, but not quite the same as harmonising laws. There are a whole range of reforms that are around the court processes that mean people don't often access courts in terms of the time it takes to resolve a matter, the expense incurred by a older person. And certainly looking at how the different ways that elder abuse might be able to be reported and to whom, and what action can then be taken. Helplines are important, obviously, but some helplines don't act. They don't have those powers. If I compare some with, for example, the New South Wales Ageing and Disability Commission or the South Australian Adult Safeguarding Unit that have powers to investigate and act, we'd like similar powers across the country. But that's, of course, a very expensive exercise. But what reform doesn't take time and money to change?
Well, I can speak to that from a WA perspective. Advocare has a WA elder abuse helpline, and we are information, support and referral, and our hands are tied. Like you said, we don't have the powers to investigate. So I would like to see more done in that space. One thing I can speak to from a WA perspective is that a lot of older people that are facing any form of elder abuse, that they want it to stop. When it's from a loved one, they want it to stop, but they want to keep on loving the person that is causing them harm. And we have not very many options at all for family counselling for older people. So if you Google something in Western Australia, it would come up with, parents separating and young children and things like that. But counsellors and organisations dedicated to having those difficult conversations with older people and older family members, older children, they're not readily available. And that's what people want. We can tell them, yeah, you can go and speak to the police. There's, intervention orders. That is the last resort. They want to maintain the family dynamic, but they just want it to be better. And some people need that hard conversation, but they don't know how to approach it. So I'll get off my soapbox now about that.
You're welcome on your soapbox to express what is needed. Could you repeat the not so fun fact that you mentioned earlier?
Yes, I can. So the not so fun fact, it was related to cults. So the not so fun fact is that cults have long exploited cognitive dissonance to boost members' loyalties, pushing them to justify extreme actions in order to align with groups' beliefs. This psychological tension plays a key role in keeping members committed to both the group's ideology and its leader. So I suppose in the term of cognitive dissonance, when people get involved in cults, a lot of the time you hear people go in and then when they come out, they're in a vulnerable place, and what they've always known has been challenged. And when it's constantly challenged and they're being given conflicting information, there's enough people around them to tell them that, what you've been told, what you've been taught, what you believe isn't exactly true, then they will shift their reality and perception to align with whatever the group's belief is. It's obviously different when you're talking about one person, a person causing harm in an older person, but the impact and the effects are apparently the same.
Thank you for that.
That's okay.
And look, I just wanted to acknowledge Linda and sharing her story of her experience and the challenges that it presented, and undoubtedly the trauma that was experienced, even though there was a successful outcome in the cases as far as Linda is concerned. But yeah, we appreciate you sharing your story, Linda, and we think it's from our experience anyway, it's a really common it's a common story that the manipulation and coercive capacities of some are make it very difficult for partners and other members of the family. I know just Kim has popped a question around, are there any studies completed on why females are more likely to be the abuser? I'm not sure of your knowledge, Shawnee, but I do know that there is currently some research being undertaken by the Commonwealth Attorney General's Department in relation to perpetrators or people who cause harm. So I believe we might be waiting a little while for the results of that research, perhaps later in this year, this calendar year. But Shawnee, do you have any insights into that?
No, it's often the females in the family, the daughter in this case, is the natural caregiver more so than any of the sons. I don't know about the research and the data, but we just hear that more often. And this is from a WA perspective. I'm hearing you say, Bev, that it's possibly similar across the country with the stats that I revealed, but I think it was because the daughters naturally gravitate towards or are expected to fall into that caregiver role, or they insert themselves in the older person's life unnecessarily. That's the only comment that I could make about that as to why that could be.
Yeah. And Shawnee, in your experience, what do you see the role of elder mediation in resolving situations like coercive control?
Oh, look, I mean, it's that awareness for the older person. And I mean, you know, I'm not talking about just one session. It would have to be numerous sessions. So it's the awareness raising for the older person, letting them know what their rights are and that this is not okay. It's hard to start off with because obviously it starts very subtly. But also if the person causing harm engages, that they've got to know, if they're not already aware, which I doubt around coercive control, you know, like I said in the definition, it's intentional and it's repeated. But that awareness that someone's got their eyes on you, we understand that you're not doing the right thing. You know, we're hearing the older person side of the story. So, you know, we're validating their concerns and having someone there to mediate or a neutral person to let both parties know that, you know, this is not okay. It needs to be addressed. And, you know, working with the older person, what are the consequences for the person that causes harm if this continues? Because, I mean, just in general terms, Bev, and this is not just in regards to older people or elder abuse, if someone's doing the wrong thing and there's no consequences to their actions and they're getting exactly what they want, they're not going to stop. There has to be a consequence. And, you know, sometimes the consequence is enough that someone has a spotlight shown on them and they are called out for what they are. That's enough for some people to pull their heads in and go, oh my God, you know, they're onto me, someone knows. Other times, you know, people are quite brash and they will continue, but sometimes just exposing the situation will help it dissipate or reduce the likelihood of it continuing.
Thanks, Shawnee. And look, I'm aware that it's now 1:30 and we're at the end of our formal webinar. There are a couple of comments and questions that remain unanswered on our side, so we'll put those together and put some responses together for you. I just wanted to wrap up by saying thanks so much, Shawnee. Really appreciate the time you've taken to put together this presentation and all the work you do with Advocare and older people in WA. It's an important role you have, and I know we've all benefited from the insights and information you've gathered over time. Thanks to, I think our peak is 267 people on this webinar this afternoon. We've still got a couple of hundred sitting with us. Maybe some just ducking off now for lunch or catching up on meetings and such, but we really do appreciate it. The link and the recording will be distributed to everyone who's registered for the webinar and will also be published on the EAAA website towards the end of next week. Lunch and Learns are now held monthly, and you can look forward to hearing from Anna Gilbard from the Elder Abuse Prevention Unit next month. And if you are an organisation member of EAAA and you'd like to present some of your work, please contact James Thomas at membership@eaaa.org.au and we'll look to be booking you in. Thanks so much, everyone. I wish you a very great day, and thanks again for joining us this afternoon. Thanks, Shawnee.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks, Bev.